London had a way of making certain women invisible, not through cruelty alone, though cruelty played its part, but through the quiet, practiced indifference of those who had never needed to notice anyone beneath their station. Agnes Whitmore had learned this truth early, and she had learned it well. She had also learned something else, that dignity, unlike fortune, could not be taken from a woman unless she surrendered it herself. On a cold March morning in Mayfair, standing before a silk gown she could never afford, she was about to discover that some men still noticed, and that one man's notice would change everything she believed about her own invisible life. Before we begin this story, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is for those who love historical romance, quiet courage, and love stories worth waiting for. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. And if you've been here before, then thank you for coming back. Now let us step into London, 1848. London in the spring of 1848 did not smell of flowers. It smelled of coal smoke and damp stone, of horse and hay, and the particular sharpness of a city that never truly slept. The Thames carried its usual burden of commerce and refuse through the heart of the metropolis, and the morning fog that rolled in from the river had not yet lifted when the church bells of St. George's began their slow count of 9 o'clock. Mayfair, however, was doing its best to pretend otherwise. In the wide, tree-lined streets between Park Lane and Regent Street, the residents of London's most fashionable quarter had constructed an alternate reality, one in which coal smoke was replaced by the scent of imported hothouse roses, in which the fog was merely atmospheric rather than industrial, and in which the concerns of the world beyond one's drawing room were, at best, a distant rumour. Servants moved between townhouses with covered trays and careful steps. Carriages gleamed despite the mud, and the shop fronts along the quieter avenues displayed their wares with the serene confidence of establishments that had never needed to advertise, because everyone who mattered already knew where to find them. Maison Delacroix occupied a narrow but immaculate premises on a side street off South Audley Street, its window dressed with a single gown displayed on a wire form, deep emerald silk, trimmed with Brussels lace, requiring no label to communicate its price. The kind of price that was never discussed aloud in polite company, the kind of price that made the discussion itself unnecessary. Agnes Whitmore stood on the pavement outside and looked at the gown for 32 seconds before she went in. She counted afterward. It seemed important to know how long she had hesitated. Inside, Maison Delacroix smelled of lavender water and money. The floors were pale oak, the walls ivory silk, and the two assistants behind the long counter were dressed in the particular shade of grey that existed specifically to disappear against expensive backgrounds. They were young women, both of them, no older than Agnes herself, and they looked up when the door opened with the alert, evaluating gaze of those trained to assess a customer's worth in the first 3 seconds of acquaintance. Agnes had learned to recognize that gaze. She had been its subject more times than she cared to count. She was not poorly dressed. Her morning dress was a soft brown wool, well made. Its seams let out once at the waist and taken in again when fashion shifted. A history of careful management written into its fabric for anyone who knew how to read it. Her gloves were clean. Her boots, while not new, had been polished with the patient attention of someone who had no others. Her hair was pinned simply beneath a bonnet that had seen better seasons. She looked, in short, exactly like what she was, a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances, sufficiently respectable to be acknowledged and insufficiently wealthy to be served. The two assistants exchanged the briefest of glances, that particular wordless communication mastered by those whose profession required the management of uncomfortable situations, and returned their attention to the silk samples spread across the counter before them. Agnes closed the door behind her with a quiet click and walked to the nearest display. The gown before her was ivory, with a bodice worked in seed pearls that caught the light from the high windows. She did not touch it. She had not come to touch anything. She had come, she told herself, simply to look, to stand for a moment in a place where beautiful things existed and allow herself the small luxury of imagining what it might be like to wear one of them, to be the sort of woman for whom such places were ordinary, to occupy for a few minutes the life she might have had if her father had been more cautious with money, or her mother's health had not required every available shilling, or the world had arranged itself in any of the 1,000 ways it might have arranged itself differently. It was a small indulgence. She allowed herself very few. "May I help you?" said one of the assistants. Her tone communicated clearly that help was not what she expected to be providing. Agnes turned. The young woman, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing her grey dress like a uniform, was looking at her with the expression of someone who has asked a polite question and expects a polite retreat in response. "I am simply looking," Agnes said. Her voice was steady. She had a great deal of practice at making her voice steady. "Of course." The assistant smiled, the kind of smile that required no warmth. "Were you perhaps looking for something in particular? Our current pieces begin at—" "I know the prices," Agnes said. "I am simply looking." A pause. Across the counter, the second assistant had stopped pretending to busy herself with samples. From somewhere to Agnes's left, a small, bright laugh quickly suppressed. She did not turn to look. A customer then, seated in one of the upholstered chairs near the fitting room. Agnes kept her eyes on the ivory gown and waited for the discomfort to pass as it always did, as she had always allowed it to. She was nearly at the door, nearly free, when the words came out. She had not planned them. They simply rose, the way true things sometimes did, from somewhere beneath the careful composure she had spent years constructing. "I did not come to buy," she said, to no one in particular, to the ivory gown, to the pearl-worked bodice that caught the morning light. "I only wanted to see, to know what it would feel like, to wear something beautiful, just for a day." The room went very quiet. Agnes became aware, in the same moment, of two things: the sound of the front door opening behind her, and the realization that she had said something she could not take back. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin by precisely the degree required to convey composure without defiance. Prepared, with the long practice of a woman who had been invisible in rooms like this one for most of her adult life, to walk out. Derek Ashbourne, 8th Duke of Hartmore, had not intended to be in Maison Delacroix at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in March. He had intended to send his secretary, who would send a footman, who would convey the relevant information about his sister's dress order to the relevant dressmaker's assistant, who would make whatever arrangements were necessary without requiring the Duke of Hartmore to appear in person in a Mayfair dressmaker's establishment before he had finished his second cup of coffee. His sister Cecily, however, had other ideas. "You'll never come anywhere with me," she had said at breakfast, in the particular tone that she had perfected at the age of 4 and deployed with increasing effectiveness over the subsequent 17 years. "You spend all your time at your club or your study, or at those interminable committee meetings, and the one time I ask you to—" "I will come," Derek had said, because it was easier than the alternative and because, beneath the exasperation, he was genuinely fond of his sister, in the helpless, slightly bewildered way of older brothers who had spent their childhoods trying to manage someone fundamentally unmanageable. Cecily, at 21, was pretty in the way of girls who do not know they are pretty, and would not particularly care if they did. Dark-haired like Derek, but smaller and quicker, with the kind of energy that made rooms feel more inhabited. She had their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness, and a talent for reading situations that had always, privately, impressed him. She had read this one before he had even fully closed the door. He saw her still at the threshold of the shop. She had gone very still beside him, and he followed her gaze to the young woman standing near the window display. Brown dress, steady posture, face turned toward an ivory gown with an expression of careful composure that did not quite conceal something raw underneath. He heard what the young woman said. Everyone in the room heard it. "I only wanted to see, to know what it would feel like, to wear something beautiful, just for a day." He was aware of the small laugh that had come from somewhere to his left, one of the other customers, a woman in fashionable blue silk who was studiously examining a length of ribbon. He was aware of the two assistants behind the counter, whose silence had taken on the particular quality of people waiting to see which way a situation would resolve itself. He was aware of the dressmaker herself, Madame Delacroix, appearing from the back room with the alert expression of a woman who has spent 30 years managing awkward moments in her establishment. What he was most aware of, however, was the young woman's spine, the way she had straightened it, the precise, deliberate degree by which she had lifted her chin, the absolute refusal, communicated entirely through posture, to allow this moment to become something she could not walk away from with her dignity intact. He had seen that particular form of courage before. He had not expected to see it here. Derek moved before he had consciously decided to move, 3 quiet steps across pale oak floors, and addressed Madame Delacroix in a tone that required no elevation to convey its meaning. "The lady," he said, "will be attended to before anyone else." The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. Madame Delacroix, who had been in the business of dressing London's finest for 3 decades and had navigated social complications of every conceivable variety, took precisely 2 seconds to assess the situation before she became instantaneously the most accommodating woman in Mayfair. "But of course, Your Grace." "Mademoiselle," she turned to Agnes with a smile of genuine warmth that had not been present 30 seconds earlier. "Please allow me to show you to a seat." Agnes had turned. Derek had anticipated many things in the course of a long and complicated life. He had not anticipated the expression on her face when she turned. Not gratitude, not relief, not the flustered embarrassment that might have been expected, but something considerably more interesting. A clear, direct, slightly wary assessment that looked him over with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman deciding whether to be grateful or irritated. She appeared to decide, provisionally, on cautious. "I am afraid," she said, addressing him with perfect composure, "that there has been a misunderstanding. I was not waiting to be attended to. I was about to leave." "Then stay," he said, simply, as though it required no further explanation. "I cannot afford—" "Cecily." He turned to his sister, who had been watching this exchange with an expression of barely contained delight. "You mentioned at breakfast that you wished to give Miss Hartwell a gift for her approaching wedding." Cecily, who had mentioned no such thing and who had no acquaintance named Miss Hartwell, blinked once and then, because she was, as he had always known, a woman of considerable intelligence and quicker instincts than most, smiled with perfect naturalness. "I did, yes. I was hoping to find something here, in fact." She turned to Agnes with the easy warmth of a woman who made friends the way other people breathe. "Would you allow me to ask your opinion? I find I'm hopeless at these decisions without a second view." Agnes understood, within approximately 30 seconds, what was happening. She was not a foolish woman. She could see the slight pause before the sister had spoken, the way the Duke had set up the excuse with the ease of someone accustomed to managing situations without appearing to manage them. She could see the dressmaker's transformation from cool indifference to attentive warmth, could hear the now silent customer in blue silk, affecting a very thorough interest in a bolt of muslin. She should refuse. She knew she should refuse. She had her pride, which was considerable, and her principles, which were firm, and the long-learned instinct of a woman who had discovered early that accepting things from strangers, even well-intentioned strangers, created obligations she was not prepared to repay. And yet, Lady Cecily was looking at her with an expression of such genuine friendliness, such open and uncomplicated interest, that Agnes found her refusal momentarily unavailable. "A second opinion," Agnes said carefully. "Exactly." Cecily gestured toward the chairs near the fitting room. "I can never decide between colors. My brother is entirely useless in this regard. He thinks everything should be navy blue, which tells you everything about him." "Navy is practical," the Duke said, without apparent offense. "Navy is dull," his sister replied pleasantly, and took Agnes's arm as though they had been acquainted for years, steering her gently toward the chairs with the cheerful determination of a woman who had decided what was going to happen next and was merely being polite about implementing it. Agnes allowed herself to be steered. She told herself it was because refusing would have caused a scene, which was exactly what she had come here to avoid. She told herself it was because Lady Cecily's friendliness was the uncomplicated variety that was difficult to rebuff without genuine rudeness. She told herself it was because the alternative, walking out alone into the March cold with nothing but her dignity, was something she had done 100 times before and would do 100 times again, and perhaps just this once she was tired of it. She did not tell herself it was because when the Duke of Hartmore had looked at her and said "stay," in that quiet, certain voice, something in her chest had shifted in a way she had no immediate framework for understanding. That was a thought she put away carefully, like a letter received in error, to be returned unopened at the earliest opportunity. The next hour was, Agnes would think afterward, among the strangest of her life. Madame Delacroix produced tea, which Agnes had certainly not been offered before, and a selection of fabrics in colours that ranged from pale gold to deep rose, which were laid across the counter with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Lady Cecily applied herself to the serious business of selecting a gift for the fictional Miss Hartwell, with genuine enthusiasm, asking Agnes's opinion on everything from the weight of a particular silk to the relative merits of ivory versus cream lace trim. Agnes, who had always had opinions, she had been born, she sometimes thought, with opinions, which had not always been an advantage, found herself expressing them. Cecily argued cheerfully and was occasionally persuaded. The conversation moved from fabric to colour to the question of whether Brussels lace was worth the additional cost, then somehow, Agnes was not entirely sure how, to books, because Cecily had spotted the slight worn edge of a volume in Agnes's coat pocket and asked about it with the directness of someone who considers literary taste an adequate topic of conversation with a stranger. "Middlemarch," Agnes said. "I have read it 4 times. "The ending makes me furious," Cecily said. "Every time." "The ending is honest," Agnes said, which is worse in its way. She was aware at intervals of the Duke of Hartmore. He had positioned himself near the window, not intrusively, not in a way that made itself felt as surveillance, but present. He spoke rarely. He accepted a cup of tea from Madame Delacroix and consumed it standing, watching the street outside, with the expression of a man performing patience with long practice. Once, when Agnes said something that struck Cecily as particularly apt, something about the weight of a fabric communicating the character of the woman intended to wear it, she heard a sound from the direction of the window that might have been a brief, quiet laugh. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the silk samples before her and felt unreasonably the warmth of it. When the decision was finally made, a length of pale gold silk that Cecily declared perfect, and Agnes privately agreed was beautiful, Madame Delacroix produced the bill with practiced discretion and presented it to the Duke's secretary, who had appeared at some point and now stood with the expressionless efficiency of a man accustomed to unusual requests. Agnes had been offered, in the course of the transaction, a length of the pale gold silk for herself. Cecily had presented this as incidental. "We have more than enough for 2, and I never know what to do with the remainder," and Madame Delacroix had seconded it with an air of spontaneous generosity that bore no relation to the careful arrangement Agnes strongly suspected had occurred behind the scenes. She had, after a pause that lasted longer than was perhaps polite, accepted. Not because she was fooled. She was not fooled. She understood precisely what was being done and why, and she understood that the offer was an act of deliberate kindness, engineered to preserve her dignity while accomplishing the Duke's evident intention. She accepted because it was graceful to accept graceful offers, because refusing would have undone the considerable effort involved in making it appear natural, because Lady Cecily was looking at her with such uncomplicated warmth that declining felt like an unkindness to someone who had shown her none, and because the silk, when Madame Delacroix draped it briefly across her shoulders to check the colour, had felt the way she had always imagined such things might feel, like being for a moment exactly the person she might have been. Outside, on the pavement of South Audley Street, the March fog had begun to lift. Weak sunlight moved between the clouds above Mayfair's rooftops, touching the wet stones of the street with the tentative gold of early spring. Agnes stood with the wrapped length of silk under her arm and looked at Lady Cecily, who was cheerfully pulling on her gloves and declaring that they absolutely must stop for tea somewhere, because selecting fabric was hungry work and she refused to face the afternoon without sustenance. The Duke of Hartmore stood slightly apart, speaking quietly with his secretary, his dark coat against the pale stone of the shop front. He looked, Agnes thought, exactly like what he was, a man entirely accustomed to occupying whatever space he found himself in, without apparent effort or anxiety, the kind of man for whom the world arranged itself because it had always done so. He must have sensed her attention because he looked up. For a moment, no longer than the time it took a cloud to move across the pale March sun, they simply looked at each other. Agnes was the first to look away. She told herself this was sense. It almost felt like it. "Miss Whitmore," said Lady Cecily, who had apparently been watching this exchange with the alert interest of someone who finds human beings generally fascinating. "Do say you'll join us for tea." I have approximately 40 more opinions I would like yours on, and my brother can go to his club if he finds the conversation insufficiently serious." "I have no objection to tea," the Duke said, without looking away from the street, in a tone that communicated his objection to nothing in particular. Agnes looked at the silk under her arm, looked at Cecily's open, friendly face, thought of the narrow rooms in Bloomsbury where her mother was waiting, and the cold walk back through streets that smelled of coal smoke and had nothing whatsoever of Mayfair's careful unreality. "I would be glad to," she said. "Thank you." She followed them toward the waiting carriage and did not allow herself to look back at Maison Delacroix or at the window where an ivory gown still caught the strengthening light. Some doors once walked through could not be re-entered as the same person who had opened them. She was beginning to suspect this was one of those. Tea at Gunter's in Berkeley Square was Cecily's idea, enthusiastically proposed and instantly agreed to by everyone present, which Agnes noted included her, which was itself something of a surprise. She had not been to Gunter's in 3 years. Since the last occasion her mother's health had permitted a small outing, and Agnes had spent the better part of an hour calculating whether the cost of ices could be justified, and had decided that some things were worth the calculation. Today, no calculation had been offered to her. That was something she was still deciding how to feel about. The interior of Gunter's was pleasantly busy for a Tuesday morning. A few ladies with their daughters, 2 gentlemen who appeared to be discussing something financial with great intensity over coffee, a family with 3 small children who were conducting themselves with the barely restrained energy of those who have been promised ices and are now within sight of delivery. Agnes, who had grown up in rooms quieter than this, found the noise a relief, the way public spaces sometimes were. The sense of being surrounded by ordinary human commerce, no one looking at her with anything more particular than the general survey of strangers. She sat across from Cecily, who had removed her bonnet and was now arranging her dark hair with the casual disregard for convention of someone who finds convention interesting rather than binding. The Duke had seated himself at a slight remove, not discourteous, not withdrawn, but at the particular angle of a man who prefers to watch rather than be watched. Agnes was beginning to understand that this was characteristic. "You mentioned Middlemarch," Cecily said, pouring tea with the brisk efficiency of someone who considers the ceremony of the thing to be in the outcome rather than the process. "Have you read her others?" "All of them," Agnes said. "Though I confess I find Middlemarch the most honest. Derek thinks Dorothea is a fool." Agnes turned involuntarily toward the Duke. He met her gaze with the unhurried steadiness she was coming to associate with him, and said, "I think Dorothea is someone who mistakes suffering for virtue. They are not the same thing." Agnes considered this. It was, she thought, not an unintelligent reading, and also not quite right. "She doesn't mistake them," she said. "She knows the difference. She simply hasn't yet learned that she's allowed to want the second without requiring the first." A pause. Something in the Duke's expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that could easily be named, but in the way of a man who has said something expecting agreement or argument, and has received instead a third thing he had not considered. "That," Cecily said with evident satisfaction, "is exactly what I have been trying to say for 3 years, and I've never managed to put it so well." She turned to her brother with the expression of someone presenting evidence. "You see?" "I see," the Duke said quietly, "that you were right to insist on tea." He did not elaborate. He looked back at his coffee, and Agnes looked at her tea, and Cecily began talking about the relative merits of Gaskell versus Eliot, with the cheerful authority of someone who has considered the question thoroughly and is not particularly interested in being wrong. Agnes answered her. She also, though she could not entirely have explained why, found her attention returning at intervals to the man sitting slightly apart, who asked no questions himself, but listened to every answer with an attention that was impossible not to notice, once you had begun to look for it. She made a point of looking less. She was not entirely successful. The walk back to Bloomsbury was 40 minutes in good weather, and longer when the streets were busy, which they were. Agnes had declined, politely, firmly, absolutely, the offer of the ducal carriage, which Cecily had extended with the natural generosity of someone for whom such offers cost nothing, and Lady Agnes's pride with the equally firm resistance of someone for whom accepting them cost rather a great deal. They had settled on a compromise, the carriage to the edge of Mayfair, where Agnes could find a cab at a fare she considered manageable. She sat in the carriage for those few minutes between Gunter's and Park Lane, and looked at the wrapped silk on the seat beside her, and thought about what she was doing. It was not a comfortable line of thought. She was a practical woman, had been forced, by circumstances, to become more practical than she might naturally have tended, and practical women did not become entangled with dukes. It was not a question of possibility. Agnes had sufficient self-knowledge to understand that even the most romantically inclined version of herself would have hesitated at the arithmetic. Dukes did not marry women like her. The world was arranged otherwise, and had been for as long as the world had existed in anything like its current form. What had happened today was not the beginning of anything. It was a small, strange interlude, a door held open briefly onto a world that was not hers, and the sensible thing, the correct thing, the thing that Agnes Whitmore of Bloomsbury would do, was to take the memory of it and the piece of pale gold silk and be grateful, and think no more about it. She intended to do exactly this. Lady Cecily, however, had, in the 3 minutes between Gunter's and the carriage, extracted from Agnes both her address in Bloomsbury and a provisional agreement to call next Thursday for tea at Ashbourne House, on the grounds that she had opinions about Gaskell that required the proper setting to express, and that a house with a library of 3,000 volumes was the only appropriate venue for the discussion. Agnes had agreed before she had entirely realized she was agreeing. She suspected this was how Cecily Ashbourne accomplished most things. The carriage stopped. Agnes gathered her things, accepted the footman's assistance to descend with the ease of a woman accustomed to managing such moments gracefully, and was nearly to the waiting cab when she heard her name. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. The Duke of Hertford had let down the carriage window and was looking at her, not over her, not past her, but at her, with that same direct, unhurried attention he had been deploying since Maison Delacroix, the one she had been trying, with limited success, not to notice. "Today," he said, "you wore it." She looked at him, at the wrapped silk, at the pale March light softening the hard lines of his face. "I did," she said, because it was true, and because she was, when pressed, honest. He nodded once. The carriage window closed. The footman stepped back and the horses moved, and Agnes stood on the corner of Park Lane with the silk under her arm and the sound of wheels on cobblestones fading toward Mayfair. She stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned and hailed her cab and went home. Ashbourne House occupied a corner of St. James's Square with the quiet authority of a building that had never needed to announce itself. It was not the largest townhouse in the square. That distinction belonged to the Marquis of Northmour's residence, 3 doors down, which compensated for architectural mediocrity with sheer mass. But it was the most considered. The stonework was clean, the ironwork restrained, the windows proportioned with the kind of care that suggested someone had once looked at them for a very long time before deciding they were correct. It communicated, without vulgarity, that the family within had been important for long enough to have stopped caring whether anyone noticed. Agnes noticed. She noticed everything as a rule. It was the habit of someone who had spent years navigating rooms where the rules were unwritten, and the penalties for misreading them were social rather than legal, but no less real for that. She stood on the pavement outside Ashbourne House on the following Thursday, at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, wearing her second-best dress, the grey wool, which was better than the brown, though not by enough to matter to anyone but herself, and told herself for the 4th time since leaving Bloomsbury that she could still go home. Lady Cecily appeared in the doorway before Agnes had resolved the question. "You came," she said, with the satisfied expression of someone whose expectations have been confirmed. "I told Derek you would. He thought you might not." Agnes filed this information away with the careful neutrality she applied to most things that surprised her, and followed Cecily inside. The library of Ashbourne House was everything a library ought to be, and almost never was. It occupied the full width of the house on the first floor. A long, quiet room with tall windows overlooking the square, shelves from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, a fireplace at the far end where a small fire was doing useful work against the March cold, and 2 reading chairs positioned near it, with the easy informality of furniture that had been used and rearranged and used again until it had settled into exactly the right configuration. Agnes stood in the doorway and looked at 3,000 volumes and felt something in her chest that she identified, after a moment, as longing of the straightforward, uncomplicated variety that required no analysis. "I know," Cecily said from somewhere behind her. "It has that effect, even on Derek, and he grew up in it." Agnes turned. Cecily was watching her with that alert, friendly attention, but also with something more careful underneath, the look of someone taking note. "He reads?" Agnes asked. "Constantly. It's his primary vice, which tells you something about the man." Cecily moved into the room and settled into one of the reading chairs with the ease of long habit. "He would be here himself, but he had a meeting with his steward that apparently could not be moved. He asked me to tell you he is sorry to miss the Gaskell discussion." Agnes sat. "I imagine he'll survive the disappointment." "I imagine he will," Cecily agreed pleasantly. "Though I notice he asked twice this morning whether you had confirmed." A pause. Agnes looked at the fire. "Lady Cecily," she said. "Cecily, please. Lady Cecily is what my governess called me when she was displeased, and I've never recovered from the association." "Cecily." Agnes paused, arranging her words with the care she applied to things that mattered. "I want to be plain with you, because I think you are a person who prefers plainness. Your brother was very kind last week." "You were very kind. I am grateful for it, and I am glad to be here today because I think you are someone I would like to know better. But I think it is important that we understand each other about the rest of it." Cecily looked at her steadily. "The rest of it meaning Derek. The rest of it meaning the general situation." Agnes met her gaze. "I am a gentlewoman of no fortune. Your brother is the Duke of Hartmore. Whatever kindness he has shown me, and I don't doubt it was genuine, it exists within a context that I understand very clearly, even if others might prefer I didn't." A long pause. Then Cecily said, "I think you are the most honest person I have met in 3 seasons." "I think honesty is less valued than people claim," Agnes said, "but I find I cannot manage without it." "Neither can Derek," Cecily said. "It's one of his less convenient qualities." She tilted her head. "He hasn't shown you a performance, you know. He's not capable of it, really. He's tried occasionally when social situations required it, and he's terrible at it. What you saw last week was simply him." She paused. "It surprised him, I think. The wanting to step in." Agnes said nothing. "I'm not matchmaking," Cecily added. "I want to be plain about that too, since we're being plain. I am simply telling you what I observed. What either of you does with it is entirely your own business." The fire made its small sounds. Outside, a carriage passed in the square. "Gaskell," Agnes said finally. Cecily smiled. The quick, bright smile that Agnes was beginning to understand was her most genuine one. "Gaskell," she agreed, and reached for the book on the side table beside her, and the afternoon settled into the easy rhythm of 2 people discovering that they think alike about the things that matter. Derek returned at 4 o'clock. Agnes heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the corridor, the murmur of a voice issuing some instruction to a servant, a brief silence, and then the quiet sound of the library door opening. She did not look up immediately. She was in the middle of a sentence, her own sentence addressed to Cecily, about the particular way North and South managed the question of industrial labor without sentimentalizing either the workers or the owners. And she finished it, because unfinished sentences bothered her before she raised her eyes. Derek Ashbourne in his own house was different from Derek Ashbourne in a dressmaker's establishment. Or not different exactly. He was recognizably the same man, with the same quality of contained, watchful presence. But here the containment sat differently on him, less deliberate, as though the particular effort required to occupy other people's spaces was simply absent, and what remained was something quieter and, paradoxically, more visible. He had changed from his morning coat. He was wearing something darker, less formal, that made him look, Agnes registered this and then set it aside firmly, considerably more like a person and considerably less like a title. "Miss Whitmore." He crossed the room and took the chair across from her, not Cecily's chair, which was occupied, but the one beside the window at an angle that faced both of them without directly facing either. I apologize for the delay. My steward has a gift for finding crises where none previously existed. An invaluable quality in an employee, Agnes said. The corner of his mouth moved. That is one interpretation. Derek, Cecily said without looking up from her book. Agnes has been defending Gaskell's treatment of industrial labor against what I can only describe as my principled opposition. I have been losing. Perhaps you can be more useful. I have no opinion on Gaskell's treatment of industrial labor. Everyone has an opinion, Agnes said. They simply haven't all examined it yet. He looked at her. And if one examines it and finds it insufficient, then the examination was the valuable part. A pause. Cecily, who appeared to be reading with great concentration, was not, Agnes suspected, reading at all. I read North and South when it was published, Derek said. I found it. He paused, in the way of a man choosing precision over speed. Accurate. In ways I found uncomfortable. Accuracy often is. You have a talent, he said, for saying difficult things simply. Agnes looked at him steadily. I have had a great deal of practice. He did not ask what she meant. She had the distinct impression that he understood precisely what she meant, and that he was filing it alongside the other things he had understood, without being told, in whatever careful interior archive he was apparently maintaining. It was, she thought, both reassuring and somewhat alarming, the degree to which this man paid attention. She stayed until 5 o'clock, when the light began to change in the square outside, and she became aware, with the reliable precision of a woman accustomed to managing her own time, that she had been here longer than she had intended. Cecily insisted on the carriage again. Agnes declined again. The compromise reached this time, Cecily was learning, Agnes thought, and storing the knowledge, was that the Ashbourne footman would find her a cab from the stand on the corner, which required accepting no personal conveyance and cost Agnes nothing but a moment's wait on the pavement. Derek walked her to the door himself. This was not, strictly speaking, necessary. The butler was entirely capable of performing this function. Agnes was aware of this, and aware that he was aware of it, and chose not to remark on either thing. At the top of the front steps, in the pale late afternoon light, he said, "My sister will ask you to return." "I expect she will," Agnes said. "I hope," he said very carefully, "that you will." Agnes looked at him, at the directness of it, the unornamented, unvarnished quality of the thing, with none of the social cushioning that such statements were usually wrapped in. She said, "I expect that I shall." His expression did not change significantly, but something in it did, in the way of very small things that nonetheless matter, a slight easing, perhaps, of something that had been held quite carefully in place. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." "Good evening, Your Grace." She went down the steps and did not look back, and was almost to the corner before she allowed herself to think about the warmth that had settled somewhere in her chest, and showed no signs, despite her best efforts, of resolving itself into anything more manageable. The following 3 weeks arranged themselves with the pleasant inevitability of things that have been set in motion and have found their own momentum. Cecily called twice in Bloomsbury, which surprised Agnes, who had not expected the formality to extend in that direction, and touched her, though she did not say so. She brought a book the first time, on the grounds that Agnes would want it, and she had 2 copies which Agnes privately doubted but accepted, with the gratitude she was learning to accept graceful things with. The second time she brought nothing except herself, and a great deal of conversation, and stayed 2 hours, charming Agnes's mother so thoroughly in the process that Mrs. Whitmore spent the following evening talking of little else. Agnes went to Ashbourne House on Thursdays. This had become, without formal arrangement, a fixed point in the week. The library, the fire, Cecily's cheerful and wide-ranging mind, the gradual discovery that 3,000 books were even better than they had initially appeared, because they were organized according to a system she was slowly learning to decode. Derek was sometimes there and sometimes not. When he was not, she noticed his absence in the way she had not expected to notice it, as a particular quality of the room, an arrangement that was slightly incomplete, which she told herself was merely the result of familiarity and had nothing to do with anything else. When he was, they talked, not always about books, though books were the easiest beginning, about London, the parts of it that Agnes knew and the parts she didn't, The way the city was changing in ways that were visible from Bloomsbury and invisible from St. James's Square, and the ways in which that invisibility was itself a kind of information. About his estates, which he spoke of with the careful attention of a man who considers land a responsibility rather than a possession. About her mother, which she allowed in small amounts, enough to convey the truth without exposing its full weight. Once, on a Thursday in early April, when Cecily had excused herself for an appointment that Agnes suspected had been arranged specifically to require her absence, they talked for nearly an hour about what it meant to be responsible for people you loved. Derek spoke about his father's death first, in the brief, precise way of someone who has had considerable practice at summarizing grief, and then his brother's, which had come 18 months later, and the specific quality of finding yourself at 23 in possession of a title and 3 estates and a younger sister, and none of the years you had expected to have before any of it was required of you. "I had a plan," he said, "a perfectly adequate plan, in which my brother inherited and I did something useful in some capacity I had not yet determined. I was at Oxford. I had 2 more years." "Plans," Agnes said, "are very comfortable until they encounter the actual world." "Yes." He looked at the fire. "I am told one adjusts." "One does," she said. "The adjustment is simply not always comfortable." He looked at her then, that direct, unhurried attention. "Your father." It was not a question, quite. An opening if she wanted it. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did. He was not a careful man, she said. He was kind and intelligent, and entirely without the practical instinct that might have made the kindness and intelligence useful. When he died, there was almost nothing. We discovered this gradually, which I think was worse than discovering it at once. She paused. "I was 18. My mother had been unwell for 2 years. I became practical, which is a word that covers a great deal." "It is," he said quietly. "I don't say this for sympathy," she added. "I say it because you were plain with me, and it seemed correct to be plain in return." "I know," he said. "That is why I listened." The fire settled. Outside, April rain had begun to fall against the tall windows. Agnes became aware, not for the first time but more acutely than before, of how quiet this room was, and how little that quietness required filling, and how rare a thing that was. She should say something. She should reach for Gaskell, or ask about his steward's latest invented crisis, or remark upon the rain. She should do any of the things that would return this conversation to the safe, well-lit territory of books and London, and the general exchange of opinions. She did none of these things. "I think," she said, "that you are considerably less impenetrable than your reputation suggests." He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "that you are considerably braver than you allow anyone to see." Agnes looked at him, thought of all the things she might say to that, the deflections, the qualifications, the practical woman's instinct to redirect anything that felt too directly aimed. "That," she said finally, "may be the first time anyone has called it bravery." "What have they called it?" "Stubbornness," she said. "Primarily." The corner of his mouth moved. That particular, restrained movement that she had learned in 3 weeks was his version of something considerably warmer. "Those are not," he said, "mutually exclusive. The masked ball was Lady Hartfield's idea, though Agnes suspected that Cecily had something to do with it. The invitations went out in the last week of April, ivory cards with gilt lettering, bearing the Hartfield crest and the request for the pleasure of one's company, at a masked assembly at Hartfield House in Kensington on the 14th of May. Masks required, names optional. Agnes received one. She stood in the narrow hallway of the Bloomsbury house and looked at the ivory card for a long moment, aware of the particular impossibility of it. She had no gown suitable for a Kensington assembly, had no mask, had approximately £1 and 4 shillings available for anything beyond her mother's medicines and the household accounts, and then turned it over and found in Cecily's distinctive handwriting a brief note. "The gold silk would be perfect. I have a dressmaker who owes me a kindness. Please say yes. It will not feel like charity if you think of it as theatre. C." Agnes sat down on the narrow hall chair and looked at the ceiling and thought with great clarity that she was not managing this situation with anything like the practical sensibility she had previously considered one of her more reliable qualities. Then she went to find her mother and explained that she would be attending a masked ball in Kensington in 3 weeks and needed before that to have something done with the pale gold silk. The pale gold dress, when finished, was the most beautiful thing Agnes had ever worn. She stood before the narrow mirror in her bedroom on the evening of the 14th of May and looked at herself with the slightly stunned expression of someone who has encountered an unexpected piece of information. The dressmaker, who did apparently owe Cecily a kindness, had done something clever with the cut of it, something that made the silk fall in a way that Agnes had not known silk could fall, and the pearl buttons at the back were borrowed from something of her mother's that had survived every financial catastrophe because it was impossible to sell, and with the small pearl drops at her ears that had been her grandmother's, she looked, she thought, like someone who belonged in a room where beautiful things were ordinary. She put on the mask Cecily had sent, white silk, trimmed with tiny seed pearls that echoed the buttons, and looked at herself one last moment. "You look lovely," her mother said from the doorway, in the voice she used when she meant it absolutely. Agnes turned, looked at her mother's face, the lined, gentle face of a woman who had once been pretty in the way Agnes was pretty, and who now watched her daughter with an expression that contained everything she had never been able to give her. "I'll be home before midnight," Agnes said. "Stay until morning if you like," her mother said. "Some things should be allowed to last as long as they can." Hartfield House in Kensington was blazing with light when the cab deposited Agnes at its gates. The rooms were full, not the careful, measured fullness of events where attendance is calculated, but the warm, genuinely crowded fullness of a party that has exceeded all expectations and is now simply happening, with or without anyone's management. Candles in every chandelier, music from somewhere above, the murmur of 100 conversations, and the percussion of dancing feet on the floor above. And masks. Everywhere the small transformative magic of masks, which changed nothing technically, and changed everything in practice, because the pretense of anonymity produced, in even the most contained of people, a certain relaxation of the ordinary rules. Cecily found her in the entrance hall, wearing a green domino and a mask trimmed with emerald feathers, and looking extremely pleased with herself. "I knew it," she said simply, taking Agnes's hands and stepping back to look at her. "I absolutely knew it." "You arranged this," Agnes said. "I made several helpful suggestions," Cecily said. "Lady Hartfield did the rest. Now come, I want to show you the conservatory before it gets crowded." Agnes followed her through the rooms, through the drawing room where a string quartet was performing something that vibrated pleasantly in the chest, through a smaller sitting room where a knot of gentlemen were discussing something with great intensity, through a set of French doors that opened onto a conservatory, long and warm, smelling of hothouse flowers and damp earth, lit with paper lanterns strung between the orange trees. The sound of the party was muffled here. A few couples moved between the potted palms. Near the far end, a small fountain made its domestic sound against the stone. Agnes stopped in the doorway and breathed. "I thought you'd like it," Cecily said with quiet satisfaction. "I do." "Good." A pause. "Derek is here, by the way. Somewhere. I made him come, which required significant negotiation." Agnes said nothing. "I am not matchmaking," Cecily added. "You mentioned that before. I mention it periodically because I want it on the record." She tilted her head. "He doesn't dance as a rule. He will probably dance tonight." Agnes turned to look at her. Cecily met her gaze with the expression of someone who has said exactly what she meant and has no intention of elaborating. "I'm going to find the Hartfield daughters," she said pleasantly. "I'll be back in half an hour. Enjoy the conservatory." She left. Agnes stood among the orange trees and the paper lanterns and listened to the fountain and told herself, with the firm practicality that had served her for 6 years, that she was a sensible woman in a beautiful dress attending a party at which she happened to know some of the guests, and that there was nothing about this situation that required anything other than ordinary good sense and a pleasant evening. She was still telling herself this when she heard footsteps behind her. He had not known she would be here. That was the thing he kept returning to afterward, that it had not been arranged on his part. That he had come because Cecily had insisted, and because he had been spending too much time in his study, and because the alternative was another evening with his own thoughts, which had been, for the past several weeks, less comfortable company than they had previously been. He had not known. And then he had come through the conservatory doors and found her standing among the orange trees in pale gold silk, her face half hidden by a white mask, her hair catching the light of the paper lanterns, and the thought that had been quietly assembling itself in his chest for the past 3 weeks had arrived, without announcement, in its finished form. He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked toward her. She heard him and turned. He could see in the brief instant before her composure assembled the slight involuntary widening of her eyes, quickly managed. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady, as it always was. "Miss Whitmore," he paused. "Though I suppose tonight names are optional." "Optional but available," she said, "for those who prefer to know where they stand." "I generally prefer it," he said, "though I find this evening I am less certain of where I stand than usual." She looked at him. The candles of the nearest lantern moved in some imperceptible current of air, and her expression shifted through something he couldn't quite name before settling back into the careful composure she wore so consistently that he had begun to understand it for what it was. Not coldness, not distance, but the particular quality of a woman who has learned to protect what matters by not displaying it too openly. He understood it because he wore something similar. The recognition had been from the beginning part of what unsettled him. "Cecily says you don't dance," she said. "Cecily," he said, "is frequently incorrect about what I do and don't do. She simply states things with sufficient confidence that they acquire the quality of fact." "Will you then?" Agnes asked, simply, as though it were an ordinary question. He looked at her, at the careful composure, the pale gold dress, the pearl mask, the way she was looking at him with that direct, honest gaze that had been, from the beginning, the most disarming thing about her. "Yes," he said, "I will." She had forgotten, somewhere in the 6 years of practical management and reduced circumstances and necessary invisibility, that she knew how to dance. Or rather, she had not forgotten the mechanics of it. She had forgotten what it felt like, the particular combination of music and movement and the proximity of another person that produced something that was neither conversation nor silence, but a third thing, with its own particular quality of attention. Derek danced the way she might have expected him to, well, without apparent effort, with the easy authority of someone who has done something so long it has ceased to require thought. His hand at her waist was correct, proper, the appropriate distance maintained by all conventions of the form. And yet, she was aware of it in a way she had not been aware of other hands at other waists, at other dances in other years. Aware of the warmth of it through the silk, aware of the steadiness of it, the sense that it was exactly where it was because he had put it there deliberately, and not because convention required it. They did not speak much. The music made talking unnecessary, and the conservatory was close enough that they could hear each other, without raising their voices, but far enough from the main rooms that no one was paying them any particular attention. The other couples moved around them, with the pleasant self-absorption of people engaged in their own conversations and concerns. Agnes looked up at him once, and found him already looking at her, and looked away, and did not try again for the remainder of the dance. When it ended, he did not step back immediately. For the space of several heartbeats they stood in the warm lantern light among the orange trees, and the music from the upstairs rooms drifted down softly, and she was aware of his hand still at her waist, not pressing, not demanding, simply there, and of the quality of the moment, which felt like the pause before something is said that cannot afterward be unsaid. "Agnes," he said quietly. Her name, not Miss Whitmore, not the careful social address they had maintained through 3 weeks of Thursdays and north and south and conversations by the fire. Her name, in his voice, in this room, while his hand was still at her waist, and the lanterns made their warm light around them. She looked up at him. "I find," he said, "that I am—" He stopped. The slight compression around his mouth, the expression she had learned, meant he was choosing words very carefully. "I find that I'm no longer uncertain about where I stand." "And where is that?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. He looked at her. the long, direct look that saw more than she had intended to show, and had, she suspected, seen it for some time. "Here," he said simply. "Wherever you are." The lanterns moved. The fountain made its sound. Outside, London continued its vast, indifferent existence, entirely unaware that something had shifted in a conservatory in Kensington between a duke who did not dance and a woman who had come only to see. Agnes looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said finally, very quietly, "is a considerable thing to say." "Yes," he said, "I know." She looked at his hand at her waist, at the conservatory around them, at the party continuing beyond the glass doors without them, unconcerned. "I think," she said, "that I should like some air." He nodded once and stepped back correctly at the correct distance, and offered his arm in the correct form as though everything were ordinary, and the only evidence that it was not was the slight change in his expression when she took it. They walked toward the garden doors, and Agnes did not manage her thoughts at all, and did not, for the first time in a very long while, try. The garden at Hartfield House was not large by the standards of Kensington, but it was deep enough to provide the particular privacy that a warm May evening and a house full of people conspired to make desirable. Lanterns had been strung here too, smaller ones further apart, producing islands of amber light between stretches of shadow. The sound of the party receded with each step away from the house, replaced by the more reliable sounds of the city beyond the garden walls. A distant carriage, the wind in the plane trees, the occasional call of a night bird that had no business being in central London, but was there regardless. Agnes walked beside Derek at the correct distance and said nothing for a while because she was a woman who had learned that silence, properly managed, was often more useful than speech. It was he who spoke first. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have not said something like that before." She glanced at him. "Like what?" "What I said in the conservatory." A pause. "I want you to understand that I am not practiced at it. At saying such things. I am aware that it may have come out." "It came out clearly," Agnes said. "Yes." Another pause. "That was what I was afraid of." She looked at him properly then, at the slight tension in his jaw, the forward angle of his shoulders that she had learned meant he was working through something with more difficulty than he would choose to display. The man who occupied rooms with such easy authority, she had come to understand, was considerably less certain in the spaces between rooms, where the audience was smaller and the performance therefore less available as a defense. "Derek," she said, his name, deliberately, returning the thing he had given her in the conservatory. He looked at her. "I am not unaffected," she said, with the precision she applied to all things that mattered. "I want you to know that I am aware of what I am saying, and that I am saying it anyway." The lantern nearest them swayed in a passing current of air. His expression moved through something she could not quite name, before settling into something quieter, something that looked, underneath the careful management of it, very much like relief. "I know that there are complications," she added, because she was practical and because she would not pretend otherwise. "I am not unaware of them." "Nor am I," he said. "I have been thinking of very little else for 3 weeks." "And?" He was quiet for a moment. A plane tree moved above them, its new leaves catching the light from the house. "And I find," he said slowly, "that I have spent a considerable portion of my adult life doing what was required of me, what the title required, what my family required, what the estates required." He paused. "I have done it willingly. I don't say this as complaint, but I find—" Another pause, shorter. "I find that I am unwilling to require it of myself in this particular instance." Agnes looked at him, at the quiet certainty of it, not impulsive, not romantic in the careless sense, but the considered conclusion of a man who had thought the matter through and arrived somewhere he intended to stay. "That is also," she said, "a considerable thing to say." "I seem to be making a habit of it," she laughed, a small, genuine, slightly surprised laugh that she had not planned. He looked at her when she laughed, with the expression of someone encountering something they had been hoping for and are not quite sure how to receive. "Come," she said, "let us walk before the garden fills up." They walked. The lanterns moved, and something between them settled, not into resolution, There were too many complications for resolution, but into the kind of quiet understanding that is, in some ways, more substantial. London found out, as London invariably did, within 2 weeks. Agnes was not certain how it began. She suspected afterward that it had not been a single moment but a gradual accumulation. The masked ball had not been as private as a conservatory and a dark garden might suggest, and there were always people at such events who paid careful attention to what they were not supposed to see. A dance, a walk in the garden, the Duke of Hertford leaving with his sister, and a young woman in gold silk, which was not, strictly speaking, scandalous, except that it was something to notice, and London had built an entire social architecture on the foundation of noticing things. By the 3rd week of May, Agnes was aware of a change in the quality of attention she received when she went about her business in the parts of London where such things were noticed at all. A slight extra consideration from the woman at the lending library, a look in the park that lasted a second too long. Small things, easily dismissed individually, that accumulated into something less dismissible. She said nothing to Derek. She said nothing to Cecily, who was perceptive enough that Agnes suspected she already knew. She continued her Thursday visits, continued walking to the lending library and managing the household accounts, and sitting with her mother in the evenings, and told herself that attention was not scandal, and that she had done nothing to be ashamed of, and that the practical management of the situation was simply to continue behaving with complete propriety and wait for London to find something more interesting. London, however, was having a slow season. Lady Philippa Montford was 20 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of a social intelligence that operated with the efficiency of a well-maintained machine. Agnes had met her twice in the preceding months, once at a tea to which Cecily had brought her, and once at a small concert in Bloomsbury that Philippa had attended with an aunt whose cultural interests appeared to extend considerably further than her niece's. Both times Philippa had been pleasant, the smooth, unruffled pleasantness of a woman who has learned that pleasantness is the best possible disguise for attention. She was the daughter of a viscount with a respectable estate in Hampshire. She was the 3rd daughter, which meant the pressure of making an advantageous match fell on her with the particular weight of necessity rather than mere desirability. She was, Agnes had gathered from Cecily's occasional and carefully neutral references, widely considered one of the most eligible young women of the season. She had also, Cecily had mentioned once and not again, expressed an interest in the Duke of Hertford during the previous season. Agnes had filed this information in the careful interior archive she maintained and had not taken it out again because there was nothing to be done with it that was either useful or pleasant. She was revising this position on a Tuesday morning in the last week of May when the letter arrived. It was not addressed to her. That was the first thing she registered, standing in the hallway with the Morning Post in her hands. The letter on top bore a stranger's name, a forwarding error, and she set it aside with the intention of returning it. The second letter was a bill. The third was a note from her mother's physician. The fourth was in an envelope with no return address, sealed with plain wax, bearing her name in handwriting she did not recognize. She stood for a moment before opening it. The letter inside was brief, unsigned, written in a hand that was neat without being distinctive, which was itself a kind of distinction. Miss Whitmore, you may believe yourself to be acting with discretion. Others have noticed what you have not. There is a name for women who cultivate the company of wealthy men under the guise of friendship, and it is not a kind one. Consider whether the association is worth its cost, to yourself and to those who depend on your reputation remaining intact. Agnes read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases, replaced it in the envelope, and set it on the hall table. She stood in the narrow hallway of the Bloomsbury house and looked at the letter and made herself breathe. This was, she thought, with the practical clarity that was her best defense in moments like this, how it would go. She had known, had always known, that something like this was possible. The world did not allow women of no fortune to occupy the margins of the world of dukes without eventually requiring payment in the form of reputation. It was a tax she had anticipated vaguely, in the way one anticipates bad weather, knowing it will come, not knowing exactly when. She had not anticipated how cold the paper would feel in her hands, or how precise the aim would be, those who depend on your reputation remaining intact. Her mother. The small, careful world they had built together, the lending library, the acquaintances who were kind, the modest social foothold that was all that stood between them, and a considerably less comfortable existence. She picked up the letter again. Read it once more. Thought very deliberately about what it was and what it meant and who might have written it, and arrived at a conclusion she did not find surprising. Then she put on her coat and went to call on Cecily. Cecily read the letter in complete silence, which was itself evidence of how seriously she took it, because complete silence was not her natural state. When she finished, she set it on the table between them with a care that communicated considerable feeling held very much in check. "Philippa," she said. "I reached the same conclusion," Agnes said. "You can't know for certain." "No," Agnes agreed, "but the aim is specific. Someone who noticed something particular and chose a particular pressure point." She paused. "Someone who was paying attention before there was anything obvious to see." Cecily was quiet for a moment. Outside the library windows, June was beginning to suggest itself in the quality of the light. Longer days, softer edges. "I will speak to Derek," she said. "You will not," Agnes said calmly but absolutely. Cecily looked at her. "This is my situation," Agnes said. "I will manage it as I think best. I came to tell you because I thought you should know, and because you are—" She paused, finding the word. "Because you matter to me, but the managing of it is mine." "Agnes—" "Cecily." She met her gaze steadily. "Please." A long pause. Cecily looked at the letter, looked at Agnes. Made, Agnes could see, the visible effort of containing what she would otherwise have done immediately. "All right," she said. "For now. Thank you. But I want to be clear," Cecily said, "that my silence on this is finite." "Understood," Agnes said, and meant it. She went home and wrote 3 letters. The first was to the Lending Library Committee, confirming her continued availability to assist with the summer catalogue. A small, practical act of presence in the ordinary world, the kind that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that she was neither hiding nor alarmed. The second was to Mrs. Hartley, her mother's oldest friend, accepting an invitation to tea that she had been postponing for weeks. Another act of ordinary presence, equally deliberate. The third, she did not finish. She got as far as "Dear Your Grace," and then sat for a long time looking at it, and then folded the blank sheet and put it away, because she was not certain what she wanted to say, and she had made it a rule never to send letters she was not certain about. She went instead to her window and looked at the Bloomsbury Street below, narrow and ordinary and nothing at all like South Audley Street or St. James's Square, and thought about what she was doing. It was not the first time she had thought about this. It was simply the first time the thinking had a letter attached to it. She was a practical woman. She knew what was possible. She had known from the beginning that the situation had limits that no amount of goodwill on either side could entirely dissolve. And she had proceeded anyway, because she had discovered somewhere along the way that she was less capable of choosing safety over truth than she had always believed herself to be. The question was whether that was courage or foolishness. She had a feeling it was both. She was still at the window when a knock came at the door below, and her mother's voice, and then footsteps on the stairs, and then the maid at her door with an expression of someone carrying something unexpectedly. "There's a caller, Miss Agnes. His Grace the Duke of Hartmore." Agnes looked at the maid, at the window, at the blank sheet of paper she had not sent. "Tell him," she said, "that I will be down directly." He was in the small sitting room standing at the window, not looking at anything in particular, simply standing with the contained patience of a man accustomed to waiting without demonstrating that he is waiting. He turned when she came in. She had not had time to do anything about her appearance, which meant she looked exactly as she had been. Coat still on from her morning's errands, hat pins slightly askew, the general presentation of a woman who has been managing things. She did not apologize for it. "You've heard," she said. "Cecily told me this morning." He paused. "I want to be clear that she did not violate any confidence. She told me there was something I needed to know and that she had been asked not to tell me, and that she was therefore going to tell me because she considered it the more important obligation." Agnes had to acknowledge privately that this was consistent with everything she knew of Cecily. "I see. I also want to be clear," he said, "that I am here because I chose to come, Not because I am managing a situation, not because there is a problem to be solved. He looked at her directly. Because I wanted to see you. She looked at him. At the straightforward quality of it. No social grace, no performance of concern, simply the thing itself. Sit down, she said. I'll have some tea brought. They sat on opposite sides of the small sitting room's inadequate fire, she on the settee, he in the single armchair, both of them aware that this room was not Ashbourne House's library, that it was smaller and more threadbare and more honest perhaps for both. She won't stop at one letter, Agnes said. No. And if she escalates, if there are rumors in the right rooms, if the right people begin to talk, she paused. My mother. The small social world we have. It is not much, but it is what we have. And it is... She stopped herself, looked at her hands. Sufficient to be important. Agnes. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had come to understand was his most unguarded one. Not the social composure, not the mask of the Duke, but the particular quality he had when he had decided to say something he could not take back. I am aware, he said, of what I am about to say and what it means. I want you to know that I am not speaking from impulse. I have been considering this for some time. A pause. Longer, I think, than I have acknowledged to myself. Agnes did not move. I have no adequate way to address what Philippa has done, he said, not without creating more noise than it resolves, and noise at present serves no one. But there is one thing I can do that is more powerful than any letter or social correction. Derek, let me finish. He said it quietly, but with the certainty she had come to associate with him at his most fundamental. I can make the situation unambiguous. I can remove the question entirely. He paused. I can ask you to marry me. The fire made its small sound. Somewhere in the house above, her mother's slow footsteps crossed the floor. Agnes looked at him. At everything she had come to know in 3 months, the quiet attention, the direct speech, the man under the Duke who read constantly and thought carefully and laughed rarely but genuinely, and who had stood in a dressmaker's shop and seen her and not looked away. That is not a reason to marry someone, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. And it is not my reason. He looked at her steadily. My reason is that I have spent 12 weeks in your company, discovering that I would prefer to spend the rest of my life there. My reason is that you are the only person, in a considerable number of years, who has said difficult things to me simply and assumed I was capable of receiving them. My reason is... He stopped, the slight compression of his jaw. My reason is that the thought of your comfort and safety and happiness has become more important to me than a great number of things I previously considered significant. That is my reason. The rest is incidental. Agnes looked at him for a long moment. You are asking me, she said, in my mother's sitting room on a Tuesday because your sister told you about a letter. Yes, he said. It is not, he acknowledged, the most elegant timing. No, she agreed. A pause. Is it? He said carefully. Only the timing that gives you pause. She looked at her hands, at the fire, at the man sitting in her mother's armchair who had driven from St. James's Square to Bloomsbury on a Tuesday without announcement because he wanted to see her, and had just said the most direct and unornamented true thing she had heard in many years. No, she said quietly. It is not only the timing. He was still. I need... She stopped. I am not saying no. I want to be clear about that. I am saying that I need to think, that this is... She looked at him. This is large, Derek, and I have managed large things badly before when I have managed them too quickly. He nodded. Once, with the steadiness that was, she had learned, his fundamental mode. Take whatever time you need, he said. You may find, she said, that when I have thought, I have additional questions. Then ask them, he said. I will answer everything I'm capable of answering honestly, including the uncomfortable things, especially those, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire made its sound. Tea, she said. I said I would have tea brought. Yes, he said, with a slight easing of everything. You did. She rose to ring for it, and he stayed in the armchair, and the small sitting room contained them both, and outside the Bloomsbury Street went about its ordinary business entirely unaware that something in it had shifted permanently in the direction of resolution. The letter from Lady Philippa Montford that appeared in 3 separate drawing rooms the following week was more direct than the first. It did not name Agnes explicitly. That was the particular skill of it. It was addressed to a close friend. It referenced a certain young woman of uncertain means, whose friendship with a certain Duke had been remarked upon by several reliable observers, and it asked in tones of delicate concern whether the friendship was entirely what it appeared, given that the young woman's circumstances made the cultivation of wealthy acquaintance a practical as well as social matter. It was, Agnes was told by Cecily, who had it from Lady Hartfield, who had it from the Viscountess of Ravensworth, whose maid had overheard the relevant conversation, spreading with the efficient velocity of things that contain precisely enough truth to be interesting and precisely enough ambiguity to be deniable. Agnes heard this on a Thursday in the library at Ashbourne House, with Derek present. She had told him on the Monday after his proposal that she had thought, that she had several questions, that she had answered the questions herself, which was her habit, and had arrived at an answer to the larger question, which was yes, and that she was telling him this now because she was not, as he had noted, a person who managed important things slowly when she had decided they were important. He had looked at her for a moment in silence. Then he had said very quietly, "Thank you." She had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this was exactly the right thing to say. They had not yet made any formal announcement. There were things to be arranged, her mother to speak to, the appropriate legal formalities, the question of timing in the context of the current social climate. They were proceeding with the care of people who have decided on their destination and are not in so much of a hurry that they cannot manage the journey properly. Lady Philippa's letter made the journey somewhat more urgent. "She'll go further," Cecily said. She was standing by the window, which she always did when she was trying not to pace. "The next step is something specific enough to be damaging." Derek was at the fireplace. He had been very quiet since Cecily had finished speaking. The particular quality of quiet that Agnes had learned meant something was being decided. "Derek," Agnes said. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" she asked, simply, because she was a person who asked. "I am thinking," he said, "that I am finished with managing this quietly." Agnes looked at him. "I am thinking," he continued, "that there is a ball at the Ashworths on Friday, and that we had discussed attending, and that attending together is no longer a sufficient statement." A pause. "I am thinking that I would prefer to make something clear, publicly, with your permission." "My permission," she repeated. "It is your situation as much as mine," he said. "More in some ways, the decision should be yours." Agnes considered this, considered Philippa's letter, the carefully deniable language, the precise aim. Considered her mother upstairs in the Bloomsbury house, who had said some things should be allowed to last as long as they can, and who deserved something more lasting than a quiet arrangement that could be quietly undone. Considered Derek standing at the fireplace, waiting for her answer with the patience of someone who has decided and is simply waiting to see whether the decision is shared. "Yes," she said. "Yes to what specifically?" he asked. "Yes to Friday," she said. "Yes to the statement, yes to—" She looked at him steadily. "Yes to all of it. You may make it as clear as you like." Something moved in his expression, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else in the room might have named, but she saw it and knew it, and it was, she thought, among the most valuable things she had ever been given to see. "Good," he said quietly. "I want to be there," Cecily said from the window, with barely restrained satisfaction. "Whatever you're planning, I want to be there." "You will be," Derek said. "You generally are." The Ashworth Ball was, by the standards of a season that had already produced several notable events, unremarkable in its preliminaries. The house on Grosvenor Square was well lit, the rooms well appointed, the guest list assembled with the careful calibration of a hostess who had been performing this function for 20 years and had long since mastered the art of producing the right combination of people in the right rooms at the right time. The music was excellent. The supper, by all reports, would be the same. The evening had the settled quality of an event that knows what it is and has no ambition to be otherwise. Agnes arrived at 9:30. She came in Cecily's carriage, which was technically Derek's carriage, a distinction that Cecily found irrelevant, and Agnes had learned to stop remarking upon. She wore the pale gold dress for the second time, because it was the finest thing she owned, and because wearing it felt by now like a deliberate statement rather than an accident, and she was in the business of deliberate statements this evening. Cecily, beside her, was wearing deep green and an expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment for quite some time. "He's already inside," she said, as the carriage slowed before the Ashworth steps. "He arrived early. He never arrives early." "I know," Agnes said. "Are you certain about this?" Agnes looked at her, at the familiar face, quick-eyed, warm, the first friend she had made in this world that was not hers and was becoming, incrementally, something else. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" Cecily smiled, the full, genuine smile that she did not deploy for social occasions. "I have been certain about this since the second Thursday," she said. "Now come. I want to see Philippa Montford's face." "Cecily, I know. Not about Philippa, about everything else." She took Agnes's hand briefly. "Come." The ballroom of Ashworth House was a long, high-ceilinged room that had been designed for exactly this purpose and fulfilled it with the quiet confidence of good architecture. Chandeliers, pale walls, the orchestra positioned at the far end with the professional concentration of musicians who have learned to be decorative and functional simultaneously. And between the doors and the orchestra, a sea of London's most fashionable, the people who shaped opinion and distributed consequence, who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and whose collective gaze could, on a given evening, make or unmake a reputation. Agnes felt it when she walked in, not dramatically. She had not expected drama. It was quieter than that. A slight shift in the quality of the room's attention, the way certain eyes moved toward her with the extra consideration of people who have recently been told to look. She recognized it now, this particular form of attention. She had been its subject before in both directions, and she understood what it meant. She kept her chin level, and her pace unhurried and did not look for Derek immediately, though she was aware at the edges of her attention of exactly where he was. He had positioned himself near the far wall, not prominently, not in the center of the room, but at the angle of someone who can see everything without appearing to survey it. He was speaking with Lord Ellsworth, whose wife was currently on the committee of the lending library Agnes used, a fact that she registered and filed. He wore black, as he generally did at formal occasions, and looked. She permitted herself the observation and then moved on, exactly like what he was, and exactly like the man she knew him to be, which were, she had discovered, the same thing. He did not look at her when she entered. She had not expected him to. That was not what this evening was. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman, found a position near the edge of the room with a clear line of sight to most of it, waited. Cecily materialized beside her within 2 minutes. "There she is," she murmured, with the studied neutrality of a woman keeping a commitment. Agnes did not need to ask who. Lady Philippa Montford was standing with a group near the windows, dark-haired, composed, wearing pale blue with the ease of a woman who knows she is well dressed. She was laughing at something one of her companions had said, with the practiced brightness of someone who has learned that appearing carefree is its own form of power. Her eyes found Agnes across the room. Not immediately. There was a brief, natural pause, the glance moving and then catching, the faint realignment of attention that happened when you saw someone you were not expecting. Then the expression settled into something pleasant and entirely unreadable. Agnes met her gaze directly and looked away first, not quickly, not with any sign of discomfort, but in the unhurried way of a woman who has seen what she wanted to see and found it sufficient. Derek spoke to her for the first time at 10 o'clock, which was not soon. She had danced twice, when with Lord Hartfield, who was a pleasant man with no agenda, and with young Mr. Wycliffe, who had no agenda either and a great deal of energy. She had talked with the Duchess of Somerset about the Royal Academy's current exhibition, which she had not attended but knew enough about to discuss, and with Lady Ellsworth about the Lending Library's summer catalogue, which she knew a great deal about and enjoyed discussing. She had, in short, conducted herself with the complete ordinariness of a woman who is exactly where she belongs and knows it. Derek appeared at her elbow during a pause between sets with the quiet approach she had come to associate with him, present suddenly, without performance of a rival. "Miss Whitmore," he said, formal, correct, for the room. "Your Grace," she said, equally correct. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked toward the far end of the room, not hurrying, not dawdling, at the pace of two people engaged in conversation of no particular urgency. "How are you finding the evening?" he asked. "Instructive," she said. "Philippa is watching us." "I noticed." "Half the room is watching us," he said, "which is either useful or inconvenient, depending on one's purpose." "And what is your purpose?" she asked. Quietly, only for him. He looked at her. "To make something clear," he said, "with your permission, which you have already given. I simply wanted to confirm, now that we're here, that you haven't changed your mind." She looked at the room around them, the chandeliers, the dancers, the carefully assembled company of people who noticed everything and would not forget tonight. "I haven't changed my mind," she said. He nodded once. They reached the edge of the room where Lady Ashworth, their hostess, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who missed nothing, was standing with a small group that included Lord Ashworth, the Viscountess of Ravensworth, and two gentlemen whose names Agnes recalled from Cecily's social map. Derek stopped. "Lady Ashworth," he said, with the slight increase in volume of someone who intends to be heard by more than his immediate company. "I wonder if I might ask you something." Lady Ashworth turned with the alert attention of a hostess who senses that something is about to happen in her ballroom. "Your Grace," she said. "I should like," Derek said clearly and without hurry, "to present Miss Agnes Whitmore, daughter of the late Mr. Charles Whitmore of Lincolnshire, to whom I am recently engaged." He paused. "I understand there has been some uncertainty in recent weeks about the nature of our acquaintance. I hope this resolves it." The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long. In those 4 seconds, Agnes was aware of several things simultaneously. The slight intake of breath from Lady Ashworth, followed immediately by the smile of a woman who has just been given a social gift of considerable value. The ripple of attention moving outward from their position through the room, the way a stone moves water. Cecily, somewhere to her left, making no sound at all, and Lady Philippa Montford near the windows, whose expression had undergone a shift too rapid and too controlled for Agnes to read completely, but whose champagne glass had ceased, she noticed, to rise toward her lips. And Derek, beside her, whose arm under her hand was entirely steady, who was looking at Lady Ashworth with the calm certainty of a man who has decided and does not intend to revisit the decision. "Miss Whitmore," said Lady Ashworth, with the warmth of someone who has re-evaluated a situation and landed squarely on the correct side of it. "What an enormous pleasure. I hope you will allow me to introduce you to some of my guests." "I would be glad to," Agnes said. Her voice came out steady. She was, she thought, becoming reliably good at that. The next hour was something Agnes would remember for the rest of her life, not for its drama. There was none which was itself remarkable, but for its quality. The quality of being introduced, properly, with a name and a context and a position that belonged to her, not borrowed, not provisional, not contingent on anyone's continued goodwill. The quality of watching London's attention reorganize itself around a new fact with the efficient pragmatism that had always been, beneath its elaborate social rituals, its most useful characteristic. Lady Ashworth introduced her to 6 people. 3 of them were women whose opinions, Cecily had once told her, shaped the consensus of the season. All 3 were pleasant. One was genuinely warm. Agnes spoke to all of them with the directness she always used and the awareness, novel and slightly vertiginous, that she was doing so as someone whose position in the room was no longer ambiguous. Derek stayed close. Not intrusively. He moved through the room in his own right, spoke to his own acquaintances, but close enough that the fact of their connection was visible to anyone paying attention, which was everyone. Once, across the width of the room, she caught his eye. He did not smile. That was not his way, not in public, not with people watching. But something in his expression shifted in the direction of warmth. The way it did when he thought something she had said was exactly right. She looked away, and found that she was smiling quietly at the middle distance in a way she made no effort to manage. Philippa Montford left the ball at 10:30. Agnes noticed, not because she was watching, she was not watching, but because Cecily materialized beside her a few minutes later, with the expression of someone delivering a report. "She's gone," Cecily said. "I know. She didn't say goodbye to Lady Ashworth." "That," Agnes said, "is her own affair." Cecily was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" Agnes considered the question, considered the ballroom around her, the sound of the music, the glass of champagne she was holding, the weight of the evening and everything in it. "Yes," she said, and meant it, in the particular way she had learned to mean things, not perfectly, not without reservation, but genuinely, in the place where genuine things lived. "Good," Cecily said. She paused. "He's going to be insufferable, you know. Not outwardly. He's not capable of insufferable outwardly. But internally. He will be very quietly, very completely certain that he was right about all of it, and he will carry that around forever." "Was he right about all of it?" Agnes asked. "About you." Cecily looked at her. "Yes, insufferably so." Agnes looked at her. This woman who had taken her by the arm in a dressmaker's shop and made her stay, who had brought books to Bloomsbury and argued about Gaskell and said, "I am not matchmaking," with such regularity that it had become its own form of communication. "Thank you," Agnes said, plainly because it was the only way she knew to say something she meant completely. Cecily's expression did something she did not usually permit it to do in public. "Don't," she said. "So you'll start me off, and I've spent a great deal of effort on this face tonight." Agnes laughed. Cecily laughed. And then they were simply two women standing in a ballroom laughing at something that was not quite sayable, which was perhaps the most honest thing that had happened all evening. Derek found her near midnight, when the ball had reached the comfortable latter stage of itself, the dancers thinning and the conversation deepening and the supper room doing a brisk trade. He found her by the tall windows at the end of the room, which looked out onto the darkness of Grosvenor Square, where the gas lamps made small amber circles in the June night. He stood beside her. They looked at the square together. "Are you tired?" he asked. "Not very." She paused. "Are you?" "No." A comfortable quiet settled between them. The orchestra was playing something slower now, a waltz, gentle and unhurried. Below, a carriage moved along the square's perimeter, its lanterns making moving points of light. "You said something in the conservatory at Hartfield House," Agnes said, "that you were no longer uncertain about where you stood." "I remember." "I was uncertain," she said. "I want you to know that. I have been uncertain for most of this, which is not a comfortable state for someone who prefers clarity." "I know," he said. "I am not uncertain now," she said. She looked at him, at the profile of him, the window light catching the strong line of his jaw, the forward set of his shoulders that she had long since learned to read. "I want you to know that specifically. Not the public version of it, not the announced version. The true one." He turned to look at her. "I love you," she said. Simply, the way she said things she meant. That is the true version. The waltz continued its patient, unhurried measure. The square below went about its midnight business. Derek looked at her for a moment, the long, direct look that had seen her from the beginning, in a dressmaker's shop when she had said, "I only wanted to see," and had not looked away then and did not look away now. "Agnes," he said. "Yes?" "I have loved you," he said quietly, "since the second Thursday." She looked at him, at the complete simplicity of it. No embellishment, no qualification, no careful management of expression. "Cecily mentioned the second Thursday," Agnes said. "Cecily," he said, "mentions a great many things." She was right in this instance. "She usually is," he said. "I find it consistently inconvenient." Agnes looked back at the window, at the square below, and the gas lamps, and the June night that smelled of London, coal and the river, and faintly, the plane trees beginning their summer abundance. "Take me home," she said. "It is late, and my mother will be awake waiting, and I should like to tell her." He offered his arm. She took it. And they walked through the thinning ballroom of Ashworth House, not hurrying, not with any particular ceremony, through rooms that parted for them with the easy naturalness of people who have already reorganized their understanding and are simply living in the new arrangement out into the cool June night, where the Ashbourne carriage was waiting with the patient readiness of something that had always been going to be there. He handed her in, gave the Bloomsbury address to the coachman without being told, sat across from her in the darkened carriage and looked at her in the moving light from the street lamps as they made their way through London. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a long while. It was, she thought, a very good kind of quiet. They were married in August. Not at St. George's, Hanover Square. Though Derek had offered it, Agnes had looked at him with the expression she wore when something was technically possible and fundamentally wrong, and he had, with the adaptability she had come to value enormously, immediately suggested the alternative. The church in Lincolnshire where her father was buried was small and old and smelled of stone and wax and the particular quietness of country churches in summer. The guests were few, the necessary family on both sides, Cecily, Lady Hartfield, Lord Ellsworth and his wife, a handful of Derek's oldest friends whose opinion of the match ranged from quietly pleased to enthusiastically approving. Agnes's mother sat in the front pew and wept, which she had promised she would not, and which Agnes had expected, and said nothing about. Cecily, beside her, did not weep. She wore the expression of a woman in possession of complete satisfaction, which was its own form of emotion. The ceremony was brief, the vows were plain. Agnes said hers in the clear, steady voice she had always used for things that mattered, and Derek said his in the low, certain tone of a man who does not require an audience to be serious, and the old church held them both in its summer quiet, and outside the Lincolnshire sky was the particular blue of August afternoons that look afterward exactly as you remembered them. When they walked out into the light, husband and wife, the new Duchess of Hartmore, and the man who had asked her to stay in a dressmaker's shop on a cold March morning, Cecily began to clap. She was the only one, for approximately 2 seconds. Then everyone else joined her, and the sound rose into the summer air, and Agnes laughed and Derek looked at her laughing and made no effort at all to manage his expression. It was, several people noted afterward, the first time anyone had seen the Duke of Hartmore smile at a public occasion. London and Lincolnshire. Autumn, 1851. 3 years settled differently on people than one expected. Agnes had expected, in the reasonable way of someone who had spent most of her adult life preparing for things to be less than they promised, that some portion of happiness would prove unsustainable. That the house, Hartmore House in London, and the estate in Lincolnshire, which was larger than she had been prepared for, would become ordinary in the way that all extraordinary things eventually did. That the dailiness of a shared life would wear away some of the careful attention that had characterized its beginning. She had been wrong. She was sitting in the library of the London house on an October morning, her library now, which still produced in her, when she let herself notice it, the feeling she had felt on the first Thursday. The long-held breath of someone encountering the thing they had always wanted. The fire was lit. The plane trees in the square outside were doing their autumn business of turning gold. A cup of tea was growing cold at her elbow because she had forgotten it, which Derek maintained was among her most consistent qualities. The door opened. She did not look up immediately. She was at a passage that required finishing. "You've forgotten your tea," Derek said. "I know." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from hers, his chair by long habit now, the one that faced hers at the angle that allowed them both to read independently and talk without effort. He had been out since 8 o'clock, something with the steward. She had not asked, which was one of the comfortable arrangements of 3 years. She asked what she wanted to know and left what she did not, and he did the same, and the silence between them was never uncomfortable because it was never mandatory. "Cecily's letter came," she said, still reading. "I know, I read it. She wants us in Derbyshire for Christmas." "I know. She's written a schedule." "I saw it." A pause that contained considerable meaning. "It is comprehensive." Agnes looked up at that, at the particular expression he wore when something amused him in the quiet way he allowed, the slight easing, the fraction of warmth around his eyes. "We should go," she said. "Yes," he said. "We should." She looked at him, at 3 years of him which she knew differently now in the way that only time produced, not the same knowing as the library and the conservatory and the carriage rides and the long conversations, but something underneath all of that, more structural, the way he moved in his own house, the way he spoke to the people in his care, The tenants, the staff, the family obligations he had carried since 23 and had never, in all the years she had known him, set down. The way he was with her mother, who had moved to a house in Kensington that was small and sunny, and that Agnes paid for out of her own household allowance, which was Derek's money technically, but which he had made plain, very early, was hers in every meaningful sense. The way he was sometimes in the evenings when the house was quiet, reading across from her in this chair, present without requirement, comfortable without performance. She had told her mother, the night of the Ashworth ball, "I think this is real." Her mother had looked at her with the steady, gentle gaze of someone who had known longer than she had, and said, "I know, my love, I know." "Derek," she said. He looked up from whatever he was reading, the full attention, as always. He had never managed otherwise. "I'm glad," she said simply. "In case I don't say it enough, I am glad for all of it." He looked at her for a moment. The familiar quality of it, the direct, unhurried regard that had seen her in a dressmaker's shop, and had not, in 3 years, and all the ordinary business of life, looked away. "So am I," he said, quietly, as though it were the simplest thing, which she supposed it was. She went back to her book. He went back to his. The fire burned. The plane trees turned gold outside the window. Somewhere in the house, a clock counted the mid-morning hour and fell quiet again. It was, Agnes thought, as she had thought many times now in many versions of this room, this chair, this man across from her, a very good kind of ordinary. The best kind, really. The kind she had never known to want until she had it, and would not trade for anything the world had previously thought to offer her. And that is where we leave Agnes and Derek, in the quiet of a library they built together, in a life that began with one small act of courage in a dressmaker's shop. If their story moved you, I hope you'll share it with someone who loves a good romance. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one waiting for you here, stories of women who refused to be invisible and men who were worth the trusting. Leave a comment below and tell me, what was your favorite moment? I read every single one. Until next time, thank you for being here.